cheering for tonight?
Tar Heel, born and bred. That never changes.
All right, can you all hear him?
Okay, so I need to speak a little more
How does that
succinctly, loudly.
Okay. All right. Well, Eben, in spite of Carolina, Taylor Swift, and some spring breaks, we've got a wonderful crowd. And I want to say to all of you, thank you very much for being here. And thank you for being patient with us. This is truly an unprecedented event for us. So let's just take a moment and center ourselves as we enter into this important conversation. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the blessings of this life, especially for your love that surrounds us on every side, and for your promise that you are with us now and that you will be with us always, and that we will be with you always. Comfort us with an awareness of your commitment to us, and give us hope and a deep sense of peace. Amen.
Amen.
I was saying to Eben that one of the things that we're deeply aware of this night is that all of us desire to know what happens to us when we die. That's one thing that we all have in common. And for some of us here this night, it's a pressing question. Not because of that necessarily, but for some people here this night, we know that you've recently lost a loved one. And that reality is still very raw and fresh in your heart. There are some who are here this night who have lost children. And that, though it may have been many years ago, that memory and that pain is very fresh. There are others that are ill and have come here this night seeking understanding, a sense of hope. So it's in that spirit that we have this conversation this night. And it's our hope that our conversation can be a source of encouragement to you. Our vision at Christ Church is to be a spiritual home, a place of warm and welcome and encouragement, and a place where we can have real questions, talk about things that matter, even things that sometimes are difficult to talk about. But I hope that throughout this night, that as we explore and talk together, that you'll feel a sense of God's presence, a sense of peace, and that you're surrounded by love. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eben Alexander. Eben, tell me about the faith and sort of spirituality of your childhood. Did you grow up in a family where faith was present?
I did. I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, although I will say that I found out in the year 2007 that I was actually born in Charlotte, of all places.
Wow.
My parents were both religious. We belonged to Centenary United Methodist Church in Winston. We went there, every Sunday for forever and ever. And my father had been a combat surgeon in the Pacific in World War II. He had a very strong religious faith. I think that's what got him through that war relatively unscathed. He also was very much a scientist. He was the head of the neurosurgery program at Wake Forest Baptist, and was really a world-renowned neurosurgeon, very much believed in science. for him there was never any conflict. You know, he knew a God that was so powerful and so all-loving that there was never a question. He knew his science would never impinge on that territory. And I grew up as a child, you know, in the 60s and 70s, very much believing science is the pathway to truth. I went to church. I enjoyed church very much, and wanted so much to believe in an afterlife and God and heaven and everything that I was taught in church. And the scientific side, for me, was a little more conflicting. And especially as I got into my neurosurgical career in 20 years plus. And I was just not sure how consciousness could survive the death of the brain and body. And of course, in retrospect, I now realize that one would have to confess that modern neuroscience and reductive materialist science really doesn't know much at all about consciousness, how it comes up out of the brain. In fact, we use general anesthesia. We've done it every day for 150 years. Still don't really know how it works. So that should give you an idea how little we know about.
That's very comforting.
Yes.
It's very comforting.
How little we know about consciousness.
When you say the word consciousness, tell me what you mean by consciousness.
Okay, I think it's interesting because consciousness is the one thing with which we're all most intimately familiar. And at the same time, it is probably the furthest from understanding in all of the known universe in terms of any kind of human thought and how we comprehend how things work. The mechanism of how consciousness comes about is probably the deepest mystery going. In fact, it's the core of what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is a well-defined entity in science and philosophy, and I would say is arguably the most challenging question known to all of human thought, and one that's probably never going to be so.
Is it awareness? I mean, if I hold this up, is consciousness an awareness of the presence of this before me? Is it a combination of an awareness of this as well as something behind me at the same time?
Yeah, consciousness is our awareness of self, and as Rene Descartes said, well, I'll paraphrase him a little bit to kind of emphasize it, but I can wonder whether or not I think, and therefore I am. And it's just the very fact that we can wonder about all these things, about the only thing you can be certain exists, I mean most certain, is your own consciousness. And beyond that, it starts to get somewhat murky, and you accept it more or less on faith, but each one of us can be pretty sure that something exists, and that's our self-awareness. And that consciousness is something that doesn't automatically just emerge from the complexity of the brain. And in all my training all those years, that was kind of the tacit assumption. Nobody ever really proved it or offered any evidence. And we saw enough in our daily work in neurosurgery that indicated that you could, with head trauma, with pressure in the brain from a tumor or something, you can alter consciousness. But I think what my journey showed me and what many near-death experiences have shown, and this includes a lot of clinical cases in neurosurgery, people under deep anesthesia, even with circulatory arrest, that in fact consciousness can do a very good job of being aware of things, often outside of the body. And that's the part that's a little vexing, especially to the materialist who say the brain gives rise to consciousness.
So up until that November day, would you say you believed, you had a belief in God to that point, or was it somehow caught up in the struggle of science?
It was caught up in the struggle of science. And in fact, as I said, I really didn't see a way that consciousness could survive the death of the brain and body. And I had seen, as do many healthcare workers, when you deal with patients who are making the transition and leaving their physical body for good, you see things that you don't know how to explain, things that suggest that there's a very powerful transition and that soul is actually being welcomed by other souls into a new realm. And yet, even though I would see those things and hear about them from patients and families, I would simply say, well, I'm sure this is part of psychology, it's part of the brain. Consciousness demands a physical brain, and that's it. And I couldn't see beyond that. And of course, my coma forced the issue, because it proved to me in a very profound fashion that rich consciousness, in fact, a more aware, free consciousness exists when we are freed up from the physical limitations of the brain.
So let's go to that November day. 4:30 in the morning?
About 4:31.
Take us to that moment and take us into that space, and what happened?
Well, my life had been going very predictably. Things were working out. We had moved to Lynchburg in 2006 from Boston area. And there was really no warning. This all just came like a bolt out of the blue. It's like being struck by a freight train. 4:30 in the morning, woke up with severe back pain. Could barely get down the hall. Thought getting into a warm bathtub would help. Didn't work. Could barely get out of there and back to the bed. My wife Holly was rubbing my back, trying to make me feel better. And then my youngest son, Bond, and that name is much more apt than I knew at that time. Bond came in the room and saw that I was in extreme discomfort, and he came over to comfort me and started rubbing my temples. And when he did, I felt like he'd driven a white-hot railroad spike through the front of my head, and I was in severe pain. But the doctor was out. I was already too far gone to put it together. Holly suspected meningitis or some other such very dangerous thing. She went down to call my colleagues, and my neurosurgical colleagues, and try and get a recommendation on what to do. They said, if he gets any worse, bring him in. She went to check on me, and I was lapsing into coma, but she thought I was resting, so she let that go for a while. And then when she came back in to check on me, I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. And of course, I don't remember anything from before that seizure for the next 7 days. I was gone from this world.
When you say gone from this world, you speak of it as a near-death experience. Was it a death experience or a near-death experience?
Well, it turns out that bacterial meningitis is probably about the best model for human death that you can have, especially if you go into coma within a few hours, which I did. With that diagnosis, you're already down somewhere under 10% chance of living through it. If I didn't respond to the antibiotics initially, and my neurologic picture was declining, and by the end of the week, I was down about a 2 or 3% chance of survival, no chance of full neurologic recovery. And it's a very it's probably about the best model of human death. The unfortunate reality is that most people who go rapidly into coma with bacterial meningitis and spend 7 days there don't come back. Usually, if you've got a severe bacterial meningitis and you go into coma within hours, by the second or third day, you're either waking up or you're dead. And so my doctors were facing kind of an unusual circumstance when, as we got into day 6, and they were talking about stopping the antibiotics just because there was really no hope left of my quality return in my life. That was an unusual situation to be in, because normally people that sick with severe bacterial meningitis don't come back. And so that's why it was especially strange that, for one thing, I had a very rare diagnosis, 1 in 10 million, having E. coli, spontaneous E. coli meningitis. Is very rare in adults. Does happen in newborns, very rare beyond the age of 3 months. You can imagine what people say about my maturity. But anyway, it was very rare, and then it was very rare to go that deep into coma and to come back. And in fact, if you had asked me beforehand, how much would such a patient experience and how much would they remember of their experience deep in coma, knowing that that entire outer surface of the brain, the neocortex, is where we put our consciousness together. According to neuroscience, I mean, for each and every one of us in this room, every moment of our existence from before our birth necessitated that neocortex, that outer surface, is the main calculator that puts together everything. Everything we see and hear, appreciating a symphony or a sunset, falling in love, everything about emotions, everything about our body in three-dimensional space and everything around us, logical thought, rational thinking, language. Every bit of that demands the neocortex to work. And my neocortex was very badly ravaged by this disease that should have killed me and yet didn't. And I would have told you, of course, such a patient would have no experience whatsoever, and they wouldn't remember a thing. And that's why it was kind of striking that when I did start to wake up on the 7th day, that the meningitis had very effectively wiped out all my memories of my life before coma, but I remembered this incredible Odyssey I'd been through. And I was trying to put it in perspective. It was way too real to be real, and I would credit my family with having a huge role in bringing me back. That includes my sister Betsy, who's sitting on the front row here. And it was, but they did an incredible job bringing me back to this world and suffering through all the really tough part. Initially, my language was coming back on that 7th day, but my family memories, Betsy and Phyllis spent nights with me in the ICU there and kind of helped bring me up to speed, but it had all been deleted. But I remembered this incredibly rich Odyssey that was very firm in my mind when I came back. And yet when I would mention elements of it to my doctors, they would say, just what I would have said before my coma, which is, oh, you were very sick. Your brain was soaking in pus. We can't even believe you've come back. Nobody can explain it. But the dying brain can do anything, so forget about it.
Let's talk about, using your words, that Odyssey. What was the first step in that Odyssey that you can remember of moving beyond, if we will, the veil of life to life?
Right. The first step was actually a very kind of crude and coarse realm. Important to point out that, my first awareness deep in coma, I had no memory whatsoever of my life, my personal life, of humans on earth, this universe, words, language, everything was gone because the meningitis had done such an effective job at wiping it out. And so it was really just this kind of murky, I call it the earthworm's eye view. I have to wonder if earthworms even have eyes. I can tell you it's not as good as a bird's eye view. And it was like being in dirty jello. I remember roots or blood vessels all around me, this pounding mechanical sound like someone smashing on an anvil. And even though I had no language, I could kind of wonder, be curious, what, who, where. And there was never even the slightest flicker of acknowledgement of my curiosity in that realm. People would often ask, well, was that purgatory or was that hell? I would think hell would be a lot more interactive. Purgatory, maybe. And, I came away in those first weeks thinking, well, that's just the best consciousness that my brain could muster when it was completely inactivated with this overwhelming infection. And it was a very crude, underground, coarse, bubbling, foamy existence. The good news is I was rescued from that realm by a beautiful white light, very clear, with fine tendrils. And it came slowly spinning and came towards me and opened like a portal up into this valley that was filled with life, very green and lush. And I still had no body awareness at all in that place, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. Now, this is not a butterfly like an earthly butterfly, but that's about the best word I could use for it. And it was moving up into this valley with millions of other butterflies, colors beyond the rainbow, and this river of color and life that was swooping up and then down into all the greenery and flowers, and buds opening, blossoming, even as we went by. And beside me on the butterfly wing, a beautiful girl. Doesn't get better than that. And I remember how she looked at me with this look of this pure love that was so far above and beyond how we often see romantic love or love between parent and child, love between lovers, the kind of, but this was so much beyond that. This was not any kind of love that would be tainted with selfishness or jealousy or anything. It was very pure, and she never said anything. She had this beautiful smile, sparkling blue eyes, never forget her face. But her thoughts, those concepts, came right into my awareness. And again, I didn't have words, but later on when I wrote all this up, in the weeks after coma, her concepts were very clear. You are loved and cherished dearly forever. There's nothing you have to fear. You'll be taken care of. There's nothing you can do wrong in this realm, in that spiritual realm. Nothing I can do wrong. People can do wrong down in this realm. But out there, I didn't have to worry about doing anything. And I'd be taken care of and very much loved. And that unconditional love, people often talk about unconditional love, but the power of it in its purest sense is really infinite and overcomes everything else in this universe and in higher universes. And I saw many of what I called souls or villagers dancing below us, and children playing, and dogs jumping, and lots of joy and mirth, souls between lives. And then above us, these arcs of these lovely, kind of perfect golden orbs of light, pure spiritual beings. And the memories of that were so kind of confusing and the most dissimilar from anything in this realm, because all of the visual and auditory and emotional components were all completely interwoven. It was very hard to remember, just how something looked or sounded. And from those beautiful swooping orbs of light, leaving these golden sparkling trails, were these anthems and hymns and crescendo after crescendo after crescendo, beautiful angelic choirs. I mean, that's what that all was. And it was astonishing. Then there was this warm, soft breeze. It was really my first awareness of that divine all through every bit of that realm. And through this realm and every realm, that all-powerful creative force. And right after that, it was out of this universe, and seeing that world, that valley collapsing down, and seeing our four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. Time as we see it here, this kind of slow, molasses-like river of time that we feel is so kind of immutable in its way. I mean, it just kind of keeps moving at this pace all its own. That's very much an illusory part of consciousness on this side of the veil. And in fact, there was a higher causality and a deeper time in that outer realm, which explains so much about near-death experiences, encountering souls of departed loved ones, after-death communications, all the reincarnation literature, which is very well established, especially the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker at University of Virginia. But a lot of that, where are memories stored between lives kind of question. So much of that is explained so much better when you understand that time flow in that outer realm is not locked into time flow in this realm. And it's really all about our relationships with those other soulmates and with those close to us, and that those connections are not lost with the death of the physical body and brain.
Your words are so incredibly rich and meaningful, and I want to try to just recapture some of that, if I may. You experienced light. You experienced music. You could see people or beings. You could recognize. Do you remember how you felt. Was there you talk about feeling the breeze. Was there ever a moment of fear for you? Ever a moment of anxiety in that moment?
There really was. There was really only one moment of fear. I think, as I said, I was amnesic for my life on Earth. And initially I attributed that to the meningitis. I mean, I think there actually were much deeper things going on that were for a reason. But for now it works well just to say, okay, the meningitis was enough to wipe out all memory of my life before. And that was a big gift because I had no attachments, no responsibilities, no ties. And I think that was part of what allowed me to go on such a deep journey. But it also was crucial in terms of some of the lessons that I was able to bring back, and that some of those would not have been at all possible if I had the full memory of my previous life. Although, of course, everything came back and then some. At the end of all this, as it unfolded.
Tell us about the girl in heaven with you and the significance of that.
Well, she was absolutely beautiful, and I can remember her face very clearly. I'll always remember exactly what she looked like. I remember what she was wearing, how she was sitting, and everything about her. As I said, that unconditional love was so pure and powerful. And in fact, I went from that realm after that warm breeze through that valley and that awareness of divine, and then having everything collapse down, going into what I call the core, which was outside of the higher dimensional multiverse, and there being told that I was not there to stay. And when I was there in that core, infinite inky blackness, but filled with that love, because that God, that all divine, all powerful, was there, as was an orb of light, this brilliant orb, and the three of us. And, this was far beyond Eben Alexander's little consciousness by that point. And being told, again, not in words, the concepts, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things, you're going back. And there were many lessons about physical makeup of the universe, about the love as the coin of the realm, and all about evil and the necessity for free will. I mean, that's the gift from God that we have, and that necessitates the evil and injustice that is here. But that's all for a very big reason. But then I would tumble back into that earthworm eye view. Didn't seem to have any causality. Why was I back down there in that simplistic realm? But I remembered the notes, the melody, and that would spin up that white light, and that took me back up into the beautiful gateway realm on the butterfly wing with a beautiful girl. She was always there to welcome me, reassure me, and then it was outside this realm to the core, outside the higher dimensional multiverse. Again, always reminded, you're not here to stay.
Well, I think excuse me.
I was just going to say that I was trying to get back to the answer of your question, because in that whole journey, I never really felt fear. Until we got to the very kind of end of it all, and that was when I'd gone through this transition out of that core realm, and then finally, as they had promised, that melody didn't work any longer, and the gates were closed, and I couldn't go back in, and it was tremendous sadness, but by that time, absolute trust that I would be taken care of. And it was there that I felt the emotions. You had asked a few minutes ago about the emotions and what you feel like out there. It's so much deeper and broader than emotions here. And so that sadness, when the gates were closed and I could no longer get into that beautiful valley, and then out into the core, there was a tremendous sadness. And out there, because of the kind of power of emotions, that's like monsoon rains throughout all of the universe. I mean, it was just stunning, and yet I did know that I'd be taken care of. And that's when I was aware of all these arcs of people going out around me, kneeling, many of them with hoods or candles. And they were murmuring, all this murmuring energy, and kind of these clouds of energy were coming up, and it was very nurturing and very reassuring. And to me, it was surprising because it was showing me that wonderful unconditional love wasn't just there, in the dwelling place of the divine, sanctum sanctorum of creator of the whole universe, but actually was all down into this realm too. Because when I wrote it up weeks later, I said that murmuring, that they were praying, and the prayers were getting through. And then I saw 6 faces, and they helped me to time the whole thing. These 6 faces would appear, and I could visually remember them, just like I remember that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, but I didn't know who they were. And they were people who were in the ICU room the last 18 hours I was in coma. They helped me to time the majority of that coma experience. But the 6th of those faces was the one that scared me. Because so far, this whole journey had been, you can continue to exist, or you can cease to exist, and it doesn't matter. No attachments, no responsibilities. It didn't matter. And it was that 6th face that all of a sudden changed everything. It was the most terrifying moment of the entire Odyssey. It was a 10-year-old boy, my son Bond. I didn't know who he was. And he had just been out and, heard enough about how his dad wasn't going to do so well, and they were talking about stopping the antibiotics. And it was when he came in and pulled my eyes open, even though my eyes are shooting off like this way and that way with the pupils not working because my brainstem was badly damaged. And I know I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears, but, in that realm, in the spiritual realm, we know all these things in much richer ways than through our senses. And he was pleading with me, Dad, you're going to be okay. Dad, you're going to be okay. And he was hugging and kissing me and holding my eyes open and looking at me like, come on, you've got to come back. And something about that broke through. And that love connection to him is what I sensed and knew I had to honor. I had to come back. And it was terrifying because now I'd never understood anything about how to make that realm work other than remembering the notes of the melody that would open up that light that became the portal into the gateway. But otherwise, I really hadn't figured much out. And so it was terribly frightening. I remember it was kind of like clawing my way out of a very deep hole and trying to get up, but everything caving in around me. And so in one sense, there was no way to get out of there, and yet I knew I had to, because I had to be there for him. And again, I didn't even have enough language at that point to tell you what a father or a son is. And yet there was that very deep connection to bond that forced me to struggle my way back up and out.
I'm struck by the bookends of struggle, life, and then struggle again back into life. I want to ask you this great question that I think we often ask, and that is, when we die, do we go right to be with God? Or is there in theology, there are lots of different perspectives. There's the notion that we die, that we're dead, and then we, at the second coming, rise to life. And then there's, of course, a belief that when we die, we immediately go to be with God. And your answer is?
My sense of it, from my experience, I can tell you that after this all happened, and I was trying to write it up as a neuroscientific report and going through thinking it must be brain-based, and of course, after a very long period of time and discussions with a lot of esteemed colleagues, I came to realize that it was too real to be real because it really happened, but in a realm that's more real than this one, but it did not happen in the brain or physical realm. And those were kind of astonishing realizations to get to. But I also started reading indie literature and then reading the afterlife literature and religious mystics and prophets going back 3,000 years, and came to realize that this realm is very real and that the skeptics get all kind of bent out of shape, banging their head against the trees and missing this beautiful forest, that realm is real. There's a lot of consistency in kind of the deeper stories about what is there. But that earthworm eye view that I describe, I actually found in a lot of the ancient writings is a pretty steady place. I think it could easily be the origin of what we call purgatory. And again, as I said, I didn't really feel fear there, even though when I describe it, it doesn't sound like a very pleasant spot. Also, of course, when you study near-death experiences, what you find is a lot of people kind of get right to a tunnel and a light, and divine beings. They see their departed souls of loved ones then and there, and can even see God or Jesus or whoever the divine light body spirit being is. I mean, I've heard atheists report incredible near-death experiences where they talk about this infinitely powerful, all-loving, beautiful spirit beyond description, but they don't know what to call it. You kind of go,
Right.
give them a hint, but those are pretty telling stories.
I'm struck that there's also that question of, when I die, will there be someone there to greet me?
Absolutely.
Will there be someone, if I am on the edge of death and life, and I'm fearful about what's coming next, can I let go, and can I trust that there will be someone there to embrace me and love me and make things okay?
Absolutely. I can tell you that never does one die alone. And what happens is the souls are there, our soulmates, loved ones, and this is what is so commonly described in near-death experiences, and it's an important thing to point out because of what I said a few minutes ago about time flow. And especially because my journey showed very clearly from severe bacterial meningitis and from the way the blinders came off when I was at that murky earthworm eye view to this brilliant ultra reality. The proof is really proof of eternity of our souls, that in fact our soul or spirit doesn't die when the brain and body die, but is actually enriched. It's awakened in a much higher level when it's not restricted by the physical limitations of the brain and body. But it's freed up into a realm that is not at all restricted by time the way this realm is. And part of understanding the eternity of soul spirit is knowing that reincarnation makes a lot more sense than anything else, and especially in dealing with the real tragedies, suffering of innocents, children, animals, loss of so many tragedies in this world. Reincarnation is a way to look at it that starts to make more and more sense about how all this works. But some people, when I say that, often say, well, wait a minute, what if Mom reincarnates before I pass over? Then she won't be there for me. But you got to realize that time flow and causality in that higher realm, that is what everything is based on. And so pretty much by definition, it's the connectedness between our souls and soulmates that is the ruling factor. And so there's no way that we're not going to be welcomed by those souls when we make our own transition. In fact, often when I give a talk to a group like this, I'll have about 8 or 10 or maybe 15 people come up to me afterwards and say, oh, I've never told anybody this before, but, and then they'll tell me a story about the greatest gift that their parent gave them passing over, or some dear friend or what have you, that showed them without any question that their soul was being welcomed into the next world. I give that one little anecdote in my book about that good friend of mine who's the chairman of one of the top neurosurgical neuroscience programs on earth, who had been with his father when his father made that transition. And the father was actually welcomed into that realm by his own mother, who had passed over 65 years earlier in a concentration camp during World War II. And that father had actually been present there as a 14-year-old with his mother. And he never talked about her, not until the very end.
And I think those sorts of questions, even though ideally heaven is a place where we don't have any anxieties or worries, there's that question of, will I see and recognize someone that I have known and loved? And then there's also that question for some who maybe really never knew the child that, say, was within them.
Mm-hmm.
What connection will there be? Will we recognize? Will we know? Will we be together? Will we be able to experience that healing in reunion? I can't help but think about Sandy Hook, for example, those precious children, and of course the teachers as well, and that the cry of the mother's heart and the father's heart to want to be together again for eternity. What did you say to people at that moment when you heard that terrible news? I mean, surely you were asked by others, what's become of those precious children and those wonderful teachers, and what will become of that ultimate relationship in eternity?
Well, my belief, based on my journey and on all my understanding of that journey, is that those souls were very, very deeply loved the moment they left their physical life here. Very comforted and treasured. And as I said, it's that kind of really senseless tragedy that for me opened my mind, especially seeing the infinitely loving and yet infinitely powerful God that I saw on my journey. It's hard to reconcile those two things, that infinite power and infinite love. How does that allow such evil? I mean, our world has no shortage of evil and injustice. And that's why, for me, the reincarnation made more sense, knowing that those souls of those teachers, those children, were very cherished, at the very moment of entry. And people would often ask about the shooter, what about that soul? Because this is all about very tough, deep lessons that we're here to learn and to teach each other. And one thing that was very clear to me in kind of going through all of this and all of my experience is also knowing that, again, my belief is that there is no eternal hell, but that any of the evil and pain and suffering that we hand out to others in this life, we either end up paying for in this life, or more likely in many of these cases, we are our own worst judge in life review after leaving this world, where we feel not only the pain and suffering that we handed out to others, and feel it more acutely and sharply, because out in that spiritual realm it's far more severe than any such pain or suffering is felt in this realm. So not only do we end up feeling that for victims, but also for their families and for every other soul who's ever known of that pain that we may have caused. And it has to do with the lessons that we're here to learn and to teach each other. And the way I see it, there's no need for any eternal hell, given what that whole process of that life review and going through that pain and feeling it, the emotions from the point of view of everyone that we ever impact in our life, in a very pure sense. One doesn't need eternal hell at all, which of course would also not make much sense from that infinitely loving and infinitely powerful Creator. But there are plenty of reasons why we're here to manifest that love, unconditional love of the Creator out to fellow beings, show compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, in spite of the evils and injustices. And it makes eminent sense. And we are given that gift of free will to make the choice. And we can either choose to go along that pathway that, is either closest to that kind of one true pathway of love, compassion, forgiveness, or we can choose to deviate from that. And that's the gift that we're given by that all-loving God who has to feel that pain if we choose not to believe. All the pain and suffering that we feel by not believing is felt even worse by God. And that is what drives that want for us to believe. It's not a threat. It's not like wrathful, vengeful, jealous. It's completely based in pure, unconditional love. And it explains so much.
It sounds like it was, the experience of heaven for you was incredibly warm and relational and comforting. And that's a beautiful image. And these ideas that we're exploring together of heaven, hell, purgatory, reincarnation, these are all very powerful, very complex words. And I think we tend to think of these words with sort of simple definitions. And, of course, as you know well, in the Judeo-Christian context, we don't embrace the concept of reincarnation. And yet the concept of reincarnation, if we look at the word itself, to reincarnate, to become alive again, there is a close connection to, say, our Hindu or Buddhist brothers, in that we certainly believe, as Jesus says in the Gospels and as the book of Revelation speaks to, of a new heaven and a new earth, of becoming alive to a new reality. So there's a close concept. I want to ask you about Jesus. May I ask you about Jesus?
Certainly.
One thing that one notices is that Jesus wasn't in your near-death experience. Tell me about that.
I think that was for a reason when I look back on everything. My father was not in my near-death experience. If I had scripted this, he would have been there, front and center. My sisters and I would agree he was a saint. He was absolutely a wonderful physician, cared for his patients, loved everybody, didn't see any hierarchy in life. Everybody was important. He was a wonderful mentor and role model. And, of course, influenced my life so much that I followed in his footsteps, even though I realized at the get-go I'd never fill those shoes. But he wasn't there. And, of course, in my initial analysis, I realized that the bacterial meningitis had been such a perfect disease for deleting my memories and allowing for a certain journey. And I came to see over a long period of time that was all really for a much higher purpose. It was not as simple as just saying the meningitis did that. But the initial lesson was that the meningitis wiped everything out, and yet in spite of that, on the very bottom of that earthworm eye view is when the blinders came off, and then this very rich, ultra-real, hyper-vivid consciousness and awareness and knowing and pure conceptual flow with vivid colors and complete intermixing of all modalities of knowing, this very rich environment, far beyond what I think my healthy brain now could muster, mainly because the brain works to kind of dumb down consciousness. And there was a big lesson there, because initially I thought that because things were deleted, that maybe that was the reason my father wasn't there. But of course, then I was also very stricken with this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, and she was there every time I went back. And that was all for a reason. And it includes the reason that I believe, in my mind, I did not see Jesus. And that has everything to do, first of all, I'm a Christian. I grew up in a Methodist church. Since I came back from coma.
And an Episcopalian.
I'm an Episcopalian, exactly. St. John's Episcopal in Lynchburg. And I love everything about going to church and praying with everyone else and just being there, going through all that process is a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. I would also say that a huge part of the lesson from my journey was very, very clear. Mm. God loves all of God's children. Mm. God loves Christians. God loves Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, skeptics, killers. God loves all of God's children. Mm. And that any aspect of a religion, to the extent that religions talk about love and brotherhood and oneness and taking care of the least and the last and the lost and being there for each other, showing compassion, forgiveness, those aspects of that religion are consistent with everything I saw in my Odyssey. Mm. To the extent that a religion says we're the only one, stick with us, we have to smite down our foes, mm-hmm. those who don't believe because God is wrathful, vengeful, and jealous. Those thoughts are dysfunctional human overlay that are not from God. That's very, very clear. And I think that's one of the reasons why this world has gotten to the kind of impasse that we've reached. And I see it as cause for great optimism because I think it's all going through a very fundamental change.
I'm struck, though, that as you practice your faith as a Christian, as I'm listening to you, your faithfulness to Jesus doesn't necessarily mean that you're for Jesus and against everybody else. And that's a very powerful idea, that to be faithful to Jesus, to follow Jesus, means to love everyone. And it's a very beautiful image.
Well, I think that's really what Jesus taught, very much. I mean, in fact, the God I saw in the message I came back with, to me, seems totally consistent with everything that Jesus knew very well way back, 2,000 years ago. He knew about time. Mm-hmm. He knew he always existed. That's why the very concept of a second coming is kind of, I think, lost in linguistic troubles, because it's more about an awareness coming to this world that's an awakening to consciousness, to knowing that we're all eternal, that it's actually more of the second coming. And it's not just for Christians, it's for all of us. And it seems very consistent. And even, I think, the Reincarnation. A good friend of mine, Herb Puryear, wrote a beautiful book, Why Jesus Taught Reincarnation. And he goes into great detail. Of course, Jesus was an expert on reincarnation, probably the acknowledged expert. He knew what he was talking about. He also knew he always had been, always would be. That's why I kind of doubt the Bible stories about his saying that, even doubting for a moment that maybe he'd been forsaken, because he knew everything. And he knew the eternity of all of our souls.
There's a French scientist who looked to the book of Revelation and the image of the new heavens and the new earth, not as that we would go to that place per se, that we might at our deaths, but that ultimately the image of the heavens invading the earth, the heavens embracing and transforming the earth, is a very, very powerful image to think about. The transformation that ultimately God will have God's way with humanity and God's creation. And it's a very powerful image. I want to ask you, I want to talk about how it's changed, this experience has changed you in the here and now. But I want to think a moment about what you saw, what you experienced, and maybe also I'm wondering what you may not have seen and experienced. So the image that comes to mind is C.S. Lewis, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. They move through, they go into that other space and time, and it seems as though they've been there for all eternity, or for years, or what have you. And then they enter back in, and they've only been gone for a few minutes, and yet they have seen so much. And yet, as C.S. Lewis says at the end of the trilogy, that it's just the first chapter of so much that is yet to unfold. So would you say, in your experience of heaven, that you feel that you were there? I know space and time is, you've mentioned that, and we might say in the sort of Judeo-Christian context, this concept of kairos and chronos time. But would you say that you feel as though you saw everything? Or how do you sort of reconcile what you saw with, say, what you didn't see or experience, and what else might be there?
Well, there were really the three main realms that I was in: the earth were my view, and then this beautiful gateway. And of course, the gateway was very much kind of like a foyer. It has earthly trappings. I would point out that I think the skeptics really have it all backwards, though, because they, they're seeing that when people come back from near-death experiences and talk about this loving light body that a Christian might see as Jesus and a Muslim might see as Muhammad, a Buddhist see as Buddha, the skeptics are saying, well, it can't be the same heaven because they're all seeing different things. But you got to remember that realm is not at all earth-like. In fact, it's much more real. This seems kind of dreamlike. This is the dreamy world, the one that's kind of foggy and murky compared to that one. It's much more crisp and real, and yet it flows in a different way. The complete disjunction of time compared to our earth time is very different. The fact that one's not seeing with the eyes, hearing with the ears, but at times becoming large elements of the whole scene. For me, that included the entire higher dimensional multiverse, which was like this oversphere in front of me in the core. And as part of those lessons, becoming every bit of it, also down in that gateway, but becoming other souls, feeling from their standpoint what their existence and emotions was all about. So it's a very different realm. In fact, sometimes I liken it to the idea from ancient Greek philosophy of Plato's world of forms, from the allegory of the cave, of an ideal world on which this world is based. And to me, that makes a lot more sense, especially in the way we interpret that and say, well, butterflies, beautiful girl, waterfalls, angels above, these arcs, orbs, and beautiful hymns. That all sounds very earth-like. Obviously, that was your dying brain playing tricks on you. It's kind of giving you these little nuggets on the way out. And yet, that's not at all what it is. And the ultra-reality there, and the way that the information inflow is very different from our normal sensory pathways. The pure conceptual flow, none of it limited by the bottleneck of language, especially in the core with the lessons there, were incredible concepts about the nature of the makeup of the physical universe, dark matter, dark energy, space-time, consciousness, mass energy, and the higher dimensional relationships, and all about frequency and music and how it connects across the dimensions. I mean, things that are very hard to bring back into the earthly realm in any kind of words. Sometimes even of concepts, because I'm convinced that realm, to me, would seem to be the core of everything that is. And the gateway realm, you could say, well, that's kind of this, a bridge between the worlds. It's kind of like in that movie Contact with Jodie Foster, when she went, through the wormhole and was welcomed by the Vegans, and they appeared as her father. And that was very comforting. And so in one sense I thought, well, in that gateway realm, we do see things that are somewhat comforting. But it's not just earthly derived. And to me, the most profound part of my journey and my awakening was when I finally came to realize who the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing was, because she lived right there in that beautiful gateway realm.
And for those who have not read the book, tell us that story.
Spoiler alert. And so, for those who have not read it, but
Well, we'll just have you read the book. How does that sound?
But I can tell you that it was absolutely shocking beyond words when I finally made the connections and realized how this Odyssey crossed through all these dimensions all the way to the core of existence.
But was the Odyssey in your the way that you understand it now? Was it sort of God's full revelation of heaven to you? Do you think, or do you think in your time and space it was a glimpse, a summary? How do you understand your experience relative to, say, what could be beyond what you've experienced? And are you both comforted, and maybe how are you feeling now about your ultimate journey to death again and entrance into heaven? How do you hold that together?
I think I can only really comment on what I saw, what I witnessed,
right.
and came back and wrote down as an experience. I didn't do any post-editing to try and clean it up.
Right.
So it's just what was there. So I can't really, I can't claim to having seen everything. My hunch is that core realm is the core of everything. And yet a lot of things, for example, evil and injustice, were shown to me almost kind of symbolically, in a sense. For example, I remember evil as being these black crystals of impurity, just a trace impurity that had these very kind of deep blue reflective surfaces. And I could see that evil and injustice were there to allow us to manifest free will as the biggest gift that we have from that Creator, the gift of life and the gift of free will to make choices. And yet that evil was presented in that kind of a fashion. So I can tell you I've read a lot of near-death accounts. I didn't read any while I was writing down my own story, because my older son had advised me, write it all down before you read anything. Very good advice, because I wrote the whole thing, 20,000 words, everything I remembered from deep in coma. And that all was there when I was first coming around, but I didn't know what to make of it. And, with that, I then started reading a lot of other near-death experiences, and I think there is a tremendous amount, a wealth of information about how one can look at that realm by reading and studying many of those other stories. And some of them I consider, deeper and, more enriched than mine. I think that what mine brings to the table, though, is kind of a stunning piece of information given the severe bacterial meningitis. And even though all my knowledge about neuroscience and consciousness was erased when I came back and kind of slowly returned in a layered fashion over about 6 weeks after my coma, all that time I was busy writing down everything I could remember. And then towards the end of those 4 to 5 weeks, I was going through my medical records, looking through my neurologic exams, realizing how rapidly I went into coma, how completely destroyed my cortical function was within the first day, how my brain stem was badly damaged, looking at the scans that showed full thickness destruction of the neocortex broadly throughout both sides. And that's where I started hitting this wall about, oh my gosh, it was too real to be real, because it really happened and did not happen in this world. But in essence, it's the exception that proves the rule. And in fact shows that there's much to be said about tens of thousands of near-death experiences and thousands of reports of mystics and prophets over the millennia, and other spiritual experiences, not just near-death experiences, and there's a whole host of them out there, that actually has a basis in reality, and it's not in the physical world.
I want to ask you how this has changed the way that you understand, the way that you are, how your family experiences you now, how your colleagues experience you, and the way that you understand your journey now. And I want to tell a sort of a story. And the story is actually about an atheist philosopher who ate something or attempted to eat something, and he choked, and he died. And they revived him. And a number of people ran to his wife and said, "Oh my goodness, that must have been so scary for you, for your husband Freddie to have been through that experience, and for you to think that, he was dead." And she said, "Actually, it hasn't been that bad. Freddie's been so much nicer since he died."
Well, I was going to tell you that if my family could use one word to describe the change, what they often would say was, "I'm nicer."
You're nicer.
So, having said that, I don't know what that says about me before, but...
How do you feel different?
Well, it really changed everything. For one thing, when you come back from that, as tens of thousands of people who've had near-death experiences will tell you, is it really changes your life. For one thing, you're not afraid of death because you know it's not an end. You realize our connectedness and our oneness, and that our connections with others, with our soulmates. And when I say soulmates, I'm not just talking about, the love of your life. Often a soulmate could be that spouse that you ended up leaving, but because you both were there to teach each other very valuable lessons, and you may very well be together in other lives in very different ways. In fact, a soulmate can even be what I looked at before my coma as my enemy, someone who may have been dead set against me, and yet I came to realize after my experience that often those are very dear and close soulmates teaching very tough lessons. And again, it's to understand the power of our interconnectedness across many lives, and in a much broader and richer tapestry than I ever thought before, when I was hooked on pure materialism and thought birth to death, that's all there is to it. When the brain goes, obviously consciousness is gone, so is everything else. That's a very limiting viewpoint that's very false. One needs to take into account that neuroscience and philosophers of mind are absolutely clueless on coming up with some mechanism for how consciousness comes out of the physical brain. And likewise, the enigma of quantum mechanics that drove the founding fathers of quantum mechanics into mysticism, very brilliant physicists, but the experiments were showing them that you cannot separate consciousness from reality. And when you start to realize what that's really telling us, it's really very deep, and it argues very strongly that spirit soul is eternal.
So how do you pray now? How is your spirituality, your religious practice different now? How do you stay in touch with the presence and the power of the living God that you've come to know so well?
Part of it is, there's definitely a lot to be said for getting that kind of rocket boost going through that experience. But also I came back to realize you don't have to almost die to get this. In fact, I knew everything I knew before, everything I needed to know to understand that infinitely powerful, all-loving God at the core of each and every one of our conscious existence. I knew everything before just by being conscious. I had just not followed the logical sequence about quantum mechanics and consciousness, and the fact that that this science, reductive materialist science, that's so close in their minds to, theory of everything. Obviously, that theory of everything is not going to include God in heaven, but you got to also realize that reductive materialist science is totally clueless on any notion about how consciousness comes up out of the physical brain, and is still completely mystified by the results of quantum mechanical experiments that say consciousness is intricately linked with unfolding reality. And So in that sense, I don't think they're very close to a theory of everything. Not by a long shot. And that's kind of an important thing to realize moving forward. And where I see all this going is actually broadening the boundaries of science very much.
So you see no conflict then between religion and science?
Not a bit. I mean, that's part of the kind of the angst of the 20th century. We got deeply involved in this worship of materialism, thinking that if you explain everything about electrons, quarks, protons, neutrons, you explain all of reality. And that's not true. It's not true at all. In fact, the thing that we know most intimately, our own consciousness, is right there at the core, because it's one thing that materialist science is absolutely hamstrung on trying to come up with any way for postulating how it would come up out of the brain. Because they think that material is all that exists, and that somehow material has to then explain consciousness. And yet in the decade of the brain back in the 90s, in spite of all the money poured into brain research, when a lot of us thought at the beginning of that decade that by the end we would have a few encyclopedic volumes that would tell you everything about consciousness. And in fact, what we did was get a lot closer to realizing that problem is so deep, it's probably the one thing that human brain and mind, especially limited by materialistic kind of thinking, will never solve.
Well, I'm struck by the passage in Scripture that speaks about we look in the mirror, we see dimly what we will know more completely. And I'm also struck by the words of Annie Dillard, the poet. Poetic language is so powerful that oftentimes when we think that we're seeing something and knowing something, that we're only seeing a part of that reality. The great gift, I think that, and I'm so appreciative of, particularly as we take in this journey into Holy Week and into Easter, as we look at our life, as we think about those questions about what happens to us when we die, what happens to our relationships, do we continue on, do we stay connected, is there hope for us, hope for love, hope for ultimate fulfillment and healing. And what moves me so deeply about your book, and I do also want to say about your life and about this ministry that you now have with this book of sharing hope and love to others, has been so incredibly transformational. And I want everyone to know that Eben didn't have to come here tonight. There are lots of places in the world that you could have been, and the fact that you are here is such an incredible gift. And I just want you to know how much we appreciate that. And I want to give you an opportunity to look around at this wonderful space and one of these wonderful people. And I'm going to give you the final word. Tell us something about what you want everyone to know here about death, about God, about their future.
I think the most important thing to know is that each and every one of us is deeply loved beyond our wildest imagination by that all-powerful Creator. And we can all come to know that, whether it's through centering prayer, deep meditation, gift of desperation. Those who have been there know exactly what I'm talking about. But that's often when we awaken to it and feel and know, and our lives are changed forever. Because once you feel that touch and know that loving divine within, you never go back. And it's a tremendous gift. And know that the realm, that spiritual realm, which is the home of our eternal spirits, is very real. It's the basis for everything in this world. There are reasons why we're veiled from seeing the reality of that. We're not supposed to see it as clearly as the moon rising in the sky every night. And it has everything to do with the fact that there's got to be some element of faith. It's not supposed to be crystal clear that that world is as real as it is, but it's something that we come to see when we leave this world. And most importantly, know that those connections with loved ones are the most important thing in the whole multiverse. And those connections that we share with each other, that consciousness at deep levels becomes one, and at the deepest level is purely divine. And we can all come to know that, and come to know, before we come to a point of death of the physical body, to come to know the truth that our souls are eternal and that we have nothing to fear.
Thank you. Could we, before we clap, I want to just invite us to pray together in this space. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of your presence. And we commend to you today, this night, all of our earthly anxieties, questions about our health, our future, our destiny. Take those anxieties and replace them with peace. We give ourselves completely over to you this night, and we trust your love, your grace. Give us this night an awareness that we are in the palms of your hands, that you have us firmly, and that we will be cared for through your love in the most perfect, wonderful, healing, tender way. Give us an awareness of that this night. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're going to do some... We are going to have a book signing over here, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work out with this crowd, but I'm going to trust God that we're going to work it out. Thank you so very much for being here this night. Good night.
Thank you.